Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Quantum Conversations, empowering communities and elevating leadership. Today, we've got Melissa Harvey as our guest from the OC Guide, an independent advisory that helps owners corporation committees navigate change in their OC manager. Melissa supports committees to prepare and run robust tenders for new managers, standardising scope, pricing and evaluation so you can compare apples with apples and stay compliant with Victorian requirements. She brings a practical outcomes first approach backed by case studies where her process delivered improved contracts, clearer governance and measurable cost reductions for schemes both large and small. If you're a committee considering a change to benchmark your current manager or to simply understand a better tender process, Melissa's perspective will help you do all those things, how to run it fairly and how to onboard successfully, amongst other things that we'll cover off today. So Melissa, thanks very much for joining us. Appreciate that.
Thanks for having me.
To start, I know you've undertaken a lot of pro bono rescue gigs, so committees have been left high and dry. What keeps you motivated to fix these messy OC situations that might come up, unfortunately, now and then in our sector?
Well, I think it comes back to why the OC Guide was started in the beginning. You know, it was to help owners corporations who had nowhere else to turn. There's not a lot of resource out there available to them to seek help. You know, you have consumer affairs, which gives you basic information, but there's nobody really on the ground who understands the legislation and can help these owners corporations where they have nowhere else to turn. And given that that's our original mission, it keeps us motivated to stay on track and live to what we value most, which is making sure that every owner's corporation can get the help that they need.
Yeah, great. So with today's conversation, we've broken into three components just to make it easier for our audience. The first component being understanding the decision to change managers. We'll touch on the tender process and transitioning to a new manager, and then finish up with selecting the right manager and any trends that you might see in the management industry moving forward. So to come back to the first component, understanding the decision to change managers.
Yeah.
Like in your experience, what are the three most common areas that the OCs are looking to change their management, how they can be addressed proactively?
Well, it can be like there's a very large range of reasons that can occur, but I find most often it's the first one would be that they want to test the market. You know, the contract is coming up to expiry and that perhaps they haven't tested the market for a long time and they want to understand how the fees they're getting charged compared to others. Yeah. So that is a proactive step in making sure that they're acting in the best interest of the owner's corporation and doing their due diligence. So that's number one. Number two is always about poor response times. You know, they're finding that they're emailing their manager or they're trying to get information from their manager and the response is just not where it needs to be. It's not meeting expectations. So a committee can address that by discussing their concerns with their manager and setting clear expectations. Because, you know, if that's the only reason why they're moving management, that's something that can be fixed. Yeah. Or hopefully, you know, if the manager has the ability to improve the relationship manager's capacity or can address those concerns, well, that would be the first point of call.
Yeah, look, and that segues to the next question about tendering can be time-consuming and taxing and costly, and what steps should they take so that they actively run that tender process properly and unnecessarily going into a tender process?
The first thing they need to do is properly understand the expiry date and the termination clauses to make sure that they are in a position where they can go into a tender process, because there's no point undertaking a tender process if they're locked into a contract and, you know, they can't get away from that. The second thing they need to do is they need to look at the last AGM minutes to make sure that the committee powers to appoint a manager or terminate an existing manager are still intact. I've found time and time again that, you know, some managers who aren't as ethical as some will take steps to put a motion into the AGM notice to remove committee's powers. So they'll say, right, let's resolve to delegate authority to the committee, but what they don't point out in the delegation of authority thing that's attached, it actually says accept the powers to appoint or terminate a manager. So they don't actually know that they're removing committee powers. So that's something that comes up time and time again. And then the second thing is you have to ensure that the majority of the committee is wanting to do that. So if you've only got 2 members on the committee that really want to make a change and the rest don't, again, there's no point in undertaking a tender process if you aren't aligned and there's not that unity or at least a majority that wanting to do that. And the third thing, which, is sort of a bit of a plug for me, if you're hiring an external company, ensure that the consultant that you're hiring has no vested interest in the outcome. Because if a consultant says, oh, no, there's no fee, it usually means they're getting commission. So therefore, they're going to push you towards a manager that perhaps is paying them the highest commission. In my experience, I've found some of the consultants are getting as much as the first year of the contract in a commission. So if you are thinking about commencing a tender process and you want to hire an external consultant, make sure that the consultant has no vested interest in the outcome. And that is one thing that we don't have any vested interest in the outcome.
I guess we probably see that as an obvious one, but committees might think to ask that.
Yeah, well, they need to ask that because they don't. They just think, oh, well, maybe there's a small commission, but they need to understand what that commission is. Because if it's the first year of the contract, what you'll find is all the tenders that get submitted are going to be increased to a higher value so that the manager can recoup that commission that he's paid. So while it might look like all the tenders are around the same price, they're all increased substantially to recoup that commission that's being paid to this consultant.
Need transparency up front.
Yeah, well, transparency is absolutely key, but if you don't ask the right questions, you don't understand.
Can you maybe walk us through the key steps an owner's corporation typically goes through when deciding to sort of change their manager?
Yeah, well, again, they have to understand the expiry date of the existing contract and any contractual terms that relate to the termination of the existing manager. They have to formally resolve the decision via majority vote. So you need to actually undertake that as a formal process so that you have documented evidence to show the incumbent manager that they have been formally terminated and it has been done procedurally correct. You have to review the proposed contract, and that is where the advantage of hiring someone like the OC Guide comes in, because we will ensure that the fairest terms are available and being put into that contract. And also we make sure that there's a range of KPIs that are measurable. And you find that committees usually don't have the expertise to understand and do that themselves. The other thing you have to do is you have to issue formal notification of termination. And again, you've got to make sure that all those steps that you take align with the legislation. Because if you get one of them wrong, you can have the manager not accept the termination. And that's problematic.
Committees, they might have some professional background, but strata or owners corporations, it's very nuanced and there's pieces of legislation and steps you need to take. And if they don't get external advice, they just miss one of those steps, it can all come tumbling down.
It does, and it's happened time and time again. And, and a manager, especially managers, they want to hold on to their business. And that's when you terminate them, that's loss of income for them. Some managers in particular that we've seen, which is, why we're quite busy, is they put hurdles in place and they make sure that every box is ticked or they won't accept your termination. And then it can go off to the whole owners corporation to vote on it and gets taken out of the committee's hands, and therefore it's very difficult.
I would hope from the majority there's a sole focus on the level of service you provide to the client, and less about setting up a framework that they can't remove if you're not providing that service. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Trust is key as well. There has to be that level of trust there, and if that trust has been broken in some way, then again, that's very problematic.
So the next component is the tender process itself and transitioning to a new manager. So how does OC Guide assist owners corporations in selecting that manager? And what do you usually recommend, maybe is the top 3 or 5 in the criteria that they should prioritise during the process?
The OC Guide, all we do is we act as your administrator. So we don't push you towards a particular manager. We don't, offer recommendations about who you should appoint at the end. If you ask us, we can nominate managers to include, to be invited. Obviously that's a big plus with hiring someone like us because we know who the good ones are and who the not so good ones are. That's an advantage. Much better than just Googling and coming up with names, because then you really don't know, what their reputation in the industry is like. A tender process can take about 40 hours, and committee members are volunteers, and it's a really big ask to expect them to put that amount of work in when they really don't have the expertise. So, really, that's what you're paying me for. You're paying me for my time.
And the reality of those 40 hours, that can go over
Oh,
weeks,
it can
weeks
go
and
over,
months.
but generally, I find that 40 hours is about the right. And and our fees are relatable to that. I don't just work out, okay, well, I want the first year, of the contract or whatever. I go, okay, well, it takes me about 40 hours, I want about $150 an hour. But the other thing too, I will say to you is, while it's 40 hours and we want to be paid, if a very small owners corporation comes to us and only has 4 lots or 6 lots, obviously they can't afford that fee. So we don't charge them that fee. It's a $60 per lot. It's capped at a certain rate. Yeah. So if a very small owners corporation comes to us and needs our help, it's either pro bono or we'll get maybe $240 to give them the same service that a large owners corporation manager is paying for us as a fair fee.
But just on that 40 hours, so the committees understand, it's not a block of time. That might go spread across weeks and months, those 40 hours of doing that.
It's usually about 6 weeks, the process.
Yeah.
It can be less because sometimes the manager might resign or the committee's already terminated and they've thought, oh my God, who are we going to hire now? I can do it more quickly, but generally I like 4 to 6 weeks to be about the time. But the first thing that we do when we're hired is that we prepare a timeline for the committee to consider. That way everyone's on the same page about what will happen throughout the process and when it will happen. It's easy for me too to put it in my calendar so that I can organise my time and make sure that I can not only commit, but work to that deadline. Because there's no point me promising everything and then not being able to deliver because I'm time poor.
Sure. Yeah.
In that process, we prepare all the requests for tender documents. We provide a detailed questionnaire for the managers to complete. We correspond with all the stakeholders, we review the proposals, we provide a summary in a report so that the committee can easily compare, like you said earlier, apples to apples. Really, our job is to make the committee's job easier. We don't contribute to the decision making. That's the committee's role. Yeah.
And I guess to that point, sort of transparency is critical during the tender process. So what do you think of the essential steps an owners corporation can take?
We're just going to go back.
Yeah, sure.
Right. So you didn't ask me about what the 5 criteria.
So maybe can we touch on the top 5 criteria as well, Melissa, that they should prioritise during the process?
Yeah. So I think the top 5 criteria: hire an independent consultant. Obviously, I'm going to say that, it's my business, but you just got to make sure that there's no vested interest in the outcome. That way you can ensure that a fair and just process is followed. And it also allows a documented process to be in your records so that anybody can access that if they question, who was appointed at the end or, at any time. It's really important to have that documented process on record. You need to ensure that all the committee members have no conflict of interest. And if they are, you should try and exclude them from the process by a majority vote at the committee. One committee member can't just say, oh, you're excluded because you have a conflict. The committee have to agree that that's the case. You need to set clear selection criteria for the participants. I think that's quite important so that everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, you need to be clear on what the expectations are the committee has of the manager.
What the important things are as to why you're selecting that new manager. If you just go in there and think, oh, I really liked him because, he had a blue car, that's really not a good reason, is it? You really need to understand, well, what are we looking for in a manager? We're looking for change. What is it that we want to do differently? And, if you're inviting the incumbent, which I would always encourage, they need to understand what they need to do differently to meet the expectations of the current committee. Yeah. I think number 4 is setting a timeline and sticking to it, so that everybody's on the same page, and the managers know when the decision is going to be made. So you can keep lot owners up to date as to what's happening if that's what you decide to do. And I think for me, one of the most important things that I always encourage is making sure that all the committee members are giving an opportunity to voice their opinions and vote for their preferred candidate without being influenced by others. Sometimes you'll find that there's a couple there who are really pushing a certain agenda and it makes other committee members sort of stand back and not feel like they have the right to voice their opinion, whereas every committee member has an equal vote and they should be able to provide that without being bullied into making a decision to go a different way. So that's what we really push in our tender processes. I find that I lead the process, and if somebody is being a little bit too pushy, I sort of step in and allow other committee members to be heard as well.
It's an ongoing challenging balancing different characters and personalities on a committee. So
absolutely. I think, you'll know yourself that people are the most challenging part of, an owners corporation manager's role. You're dealing with conflict and different personalities and different emotions at all times. And that's certainly a big part of the tender process as well. There's been times where I've come in and you've got factions. You've got your left faction, your right faction. They've all got a very different idea about what should happen. And my job as leading that tender process is to bring them together to come up with a decision that they can at least live with, helping them understand where one side might have maybe wrong opinions Does that make sense? Like, everyone's got an entitlement to an opinion, but if they're voicing things that really don't meet with legislation or unrealistic expectations, well, it's my job to educate them and help them understand where expectations should be.
And I guess part of that is the recognising, having an awareness of their fiduciary duty of making decisions in the best interests of the whole community.
I find a big part of the role during the tender process as well is educating these committee members. They come in with very weird ideas about what should happen and how it happens, or what they should expect from a manager, and it's way off. They need to be re-educated, because I want to make sure that when they go into a new management agreement with a new manager, that they don't go in there a second time with unrealistic expectations, because how is the manager ever going to be able to live up to that?
Yeah.
So if they understand what they should be expecting, then it's helping the manager as well to be able to perform to his best ability.
Yeah. During the tender process, transparency is crucial.
Yep.
So what are the essential steps that the owner's corporation can take to ensure fairness and clarity in that process?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, you make sure that the process is clearly documented. So, you can have discussions and everything, but if you're having discussions and it's about, appointments or concerns, or make sure you document that. My process is very much documented. Part of my service is that I come to the meetings, I minute those meetings. I do all the paperwork, I'm the administrator. And obviously you have the report. So the report, which summarises all the proposals, provides a very clear idea about who is a better fit for your owner's corporation. While it doesn't highlight that one's better than the other, you can actually see with the information provided which one performs better on a lot of the questions that have been asked.
Yeah.
And absolutely excluding anyone with a conflict of interest. And the other thing I would say is, if you're hiring an external consultant, that access to the full proposals is provided. So I give you a report which summarises all the proposals, but in that report is a link where all the documents that have been received from the managers who are submitting proposals can be accessed by the committee. So that way they see what I see.
Yeah. So that transparency works both ways as well. You
absolutely
can't choose to show them different documents or certain documents. They get the whole lot.
They get everything that I get. I'm very big on that, because I find that sometimes reasons that committees come to me is because the transparency is lacking. So I'm trying to prove that there are people in the OC industry that, are transparent, who are ethical, who will give you the response times that you're looking for. So I want them to have a different experience. One thing I say to all my clients is, I'm confident that you're going to have a better experience. I can't promise that you're going to get the best manager in the world, because I don't have any control over how the manager runs their business, which is why I don't offer recommendations or push you to anyone. But I'm confident that any manager that I nominate aligns with my values and my expectations, and will provide you a quality of service that should meet your expectations, rather than perhaps what you're receiving currently.
Sure.
Yeah.
And what are the three biggest challenges that they face, perhaps going through that transition to a new manager, and what strategies could help them work through that?
I'd say the first one is that the records from the outgoing manager are not where they should be. One of them thinks they might not transfer them at all, so that's problematic. And that the records that are being transferred aren't complete. So, if you're considering a tender process or terminating an existing manager, ask the manager well in advance for any records that you think you might need, before they're even aware that perhaps you're thinking about changing. So, if they're building plans or any particular record they think as a committee you want to make sure that they don't get lost in transition, you've already got them.
Yeah.
And, I say that to every committee when I first start. Are there any records at the moment that you really can't do without? So before we start this process and the manager knows that a tender process is happening, just flick the manager an email and ask for those records, because you have a right to them. I think number 2 is consider the levy payments date when you're thinking about transitioning to a new manager, because you want to make sure that when the levy notice has gone out, that all the levies or the due date has been reached before you transition to a new manager. Because while it doesn't really matter if people pay to the wrong account, because it will bounce, it's just inconvenient to the lot owner. So you want to be thinking about all the lot owners and what, is best fit for everyone, rather than, making it inconvenient for them. I would say another challenge is that the outgoing manager isn't being cooperative, and he could potentially take funds from the OC as he walks out the door. So I think it's really important to not only formalise the resolution to terminate, but maybe throw in a few other resolutions there, removing their delegated authority to take funds without chairperson written authority. When we do a tender process, there's a whole range of resolutions that we get the committee to formalise at the end of the process to make sure that all your risk has been mitigated before the transfer occurs.
Yeah. So during the transition process, communication plays a pivotal role during that. What tips are there for the committee to be aware of around the communication with the incoming manager? Look, for us as an example, we know that when we've gone through a process and taken over a client, we say to the committee, hey, here's what we'll be doing, working through the next 2 to 4 weeks. There's a lot of, we'll be liaising with the outgoing manager for you. There's a lot of communication we'll be having in transitioning the funds, the financial records, the owner records. We'll be going through those. So it's going to be, you might perceive to be quiet over the next 2 to 4 weeks, but we're working a lot hard in the background. We'll liaise with the chair to keep them an update.
Yeah.
And we'll report to the committee at the end, but there's not going to be super active engagement up front.
So during the transition period, there really isn't a lot of communication between the committee and the manager. The manager is busy in the background doing everything they can, and they will be communicating with all the stakeholders. They are the ones who will prepare something to notify lot owners. The committee can contribute to that, but I think the most important thing to consider about communication during the transition is to sit down and set a clear communication strategy for the longer term so that you're both on the same page about understanding how you want to communicate with each other moving forward. I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah. Look, hopefully that's probably explored a bit during the tender process as well when you're having the interviews and having a conversation with them. Communication, I imagine, is a big question you want to ask, what that looks like between the committee and the manager, because you want to be...
Generally with interviews, when the interviews are occurring for the shortlisted candidates, that's a question that comes up all the time. What can we expect transition to look like? And that's the important thing, because some committees think, oh, well, obviously we're going to have lots of meetings, with the manager during transition. I'm like, no, you're not, because the manager is busy in the background doing their work. Probably won't hear from them for 2 to 3 weeks, unless you want to meet and talk about strategies and setting expectations. But you need to give them time to get all the records on file, reconcile the accounts. There's a lot of work that happens when management is taken over by a new company.
Yeah. So moving forward into the next area around selecting the right manager and some trends in this space. Management fees are going to be a key part of the conversation to talk about. The committees want to ensure that they're getting value. What are 3 indicators that you sort of advise them that they can look for to ensure that they are getting that value for money from?
Well, what I offer probably more than anything else is some knowledge about what the current market average rate is. Everyone might give you a similar price, but how do you know that that is comparable to what the current market average rate is? That's what I know, because I do these tenders, I do several a month, and I know exactly what the average rate is for any size owners corporation. So I know that if the proposal is meeting expectations. And when you do a tender, you can very clearly see when you're comparing all the proposals and the fees, which ones are too low, which ones are too high. You've got a few in the middle that are all charging around the same. You know that that's probably a fair fee for the service that's being provided. Yeah. I would say that the other thing that you need to really think about is the software and how they communicate and what task management software they have. Does it enable effective and efficient communication with lot owners? Something that you really have to make sure that they have that. If they don't have some sort of strategy on how they're going to communicate with lot owners, you're not getting value for money. We've got some OC management companies who are taking it to the next level, which is great to see. They're very tech savvy and they're trying to find new ways to make it easier for committees. And I think for me, what I see that as positive in some ways, but negative in others, because you've got your tech savvy people, your younger generation who really like, automated stuff and apps and tech stuff. But what I see, most committees, they're older people. They're over 50.
I just want to pick up the phone.
They're over 60 and tech savvy frightens them. Yeah. I think that, it's great and, it's definitely a positive way, but I think for some committees, it may scare them off. I think as an OC manager, you need to consider that as well. Every committee is different and you need to be able to adapt with that. So value for money, tech is great, but is it the right fit for that particular committee? Yeah. And I think you also need to make sure that you really understand the fees. I find committees really like the all-inclusive fee structure with limited additional services fees so that they can budget accordingly and don't have to worry and manage, how many fees and making sure that they're getting charged correctly. If everyone's on the same page about what the fee is and that's all-inclusive and the manager's happy and the committee's happy, it's much easier for everyone.
Look, it's funny you talk about the task management. We're in that space where we've developed our own platform.
Yep.
We've used a number of them that don't quite hit the mark of efficiency for our team to use. So we've got 2 software developers on our team. We've developed Qflow, which is our own task management and workflow platform. And it's less about communication with the client, but just internally. There's lots going on as the company grows, and managing your time and your tasks is critical, and trying automating workflows as much as you can to streamline that service and be efficient with your resources. It's helped us a lot, and the team's really embraced it. It was built around their feedback and what they wanted to see.
Yeah, so there's one manager who went out. Committees that I've spoken to who have appointed him have been given really positive feedback, and it's more like a ticketing system, so that every inquiry that comes through, gets lodged a ticket. And although it hasn't been developed for owners corporations, it's working really well because it also enables him to monitor if a particular owners corporation is falling behind and needs more resources. Because you can have one owners corporation that's really, really busy and it's got hundreds of inquiries, another one that's sitting dormant and nothing's really happening. So what he can do is, by watching that, he can pull someone off another owners corporation for a few days, send them over to a different plan, and that way the response times are consistently meeting their targets.
Yeah.
Which I think, is something that is really beneficial for, and all owners OC management companies should consider something like that. Because if we go back to what I first said, response times, it's always about response times. Well, they don't respond, Well, why aren't they responding? What's happening? OC managers need to understand what is happening, and that sort of system can really provide those answers, I think.
I think that's probably one of the answers to the next question around the top 5 qualities, or 3 to 5 qualities that OC should look for and prioritising when selecting a new manager. And clearly communication is going to be one of those.
Yeah, communication is one, but it's really hard to... When you're selecting a new manager, the only thing that you have to understand their communication really is how they communicate with you when you're conducting an interview. They can make all the promises and talk about, how they're great at communication, blah, 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 but you don't really see it until after they've started. So I think the most important things, or the 5 most important things you look for, is, do they have a full suite of processes and procedures that help you understand how you'll be managed? Because I can clearly see in a tender process which ones have really firm structures and which ones have loose structures, and which ones haven't really thought about what their process is. So, if they haven't thought about that, that can maybe translate into that it's going to be a bit of a disorganised way about things, because they don't really understand what they're doing. They might be doing a good job, but they don't really have an understanding of how they're doing that job, and that's important. I think transparency would be number 2. Understanding how access to or records is navigated, how you can access your records, so that you can have a look at what that software program looks like, and is it suitable, and how can it be changed to suit your needs. I think you need to. Number 3 would be nominating experienced relationship managers for your OC. So who's the person that is going to be looking after us? Have they been at the company for more than a year? Does the company have a history of staff retention? Because they're key things that you need to really think about. If they're nominating a relationship manager that started with you last week or last month, is that a smart thing to do? Because they haven't even met probation. So they haven't even proven to the company yet that they've got the goods. And we find that there's a big staff turnover, and that's where response times can fall too, because they're turning over managers too much. And the committee is then left to train a new manager every 6 months that comes in. I think number 4 is making sure there's a low manager portfolio ratio. So making sure you understand what that relationship manager's capacity looks like, and making sure that they will have the capacity to look after your OC. And number 5, which is a bit of a touchy subject at the moment, but agreement that no commissions will be received. The owners corporation industry is looking very carefully at that at the moment in a review. I'm a firm believer that managers shouldn't be receiving any sort of commission, especially insurance commissions. Why would they be motivated to get you your best premium if it's going to affect their bottom line? There's a very big conflict of interest if they're taking insurance commission. So we have an expectation through our process that if you want to submit a proposal, you're not going to be successful if you've got an insurance commission included in there. I can't tell you can't nominate one, but I can tell you that every single manager who's put a proposal in through my process and has declared that they will receive an insurance commission has not been successful.
Yeah, it's a dynamic space at the moment, and there's various models that managers are looking at. You need to be transparent around, if you want us to manage claims, for example, is there a different way you want that to work? Do you want us to act for you when you're working through those claims? But a blanket commission clearly isn't an appropriate model. I made a decision from the outset that we wouldn't take them, if they wanted to engage us in an insurance process or transaction they can have a
Yeah, for me,
conversation?
it's something that happened in the olden days that was really a great initiative at the time. What a great way for OC managers to increase their revenue. And, some will still say, oh, we reduced our management fee so that, we get the insurance commission, so it allows committees to have a reduced management fee. But then you look at their fees and they're more than what other managers are proposing without a commission. So really, is that true? We need to get on board with what is acceptable in today's times, and receiving insurance commissions is not acceptable.
Can you share a success story that the OC Guide helped an owners corporation navigate a sort of change in manager, and what that looked like and what the biggest challenge was they
There's just
worked
too
through?
many. But I'm going to talk about when it was in the very beginning stages. It was a large owners corporation that the committee had tried 3 times to terminate this manager. I'm not going to name names, but this particular manager felt that the committee shouldn't have a power to terminate a manager. And in the olden days, pre-2021, they didn't have the power. It was in the legislation that they could include it in their contract that a manager could only be terminated at a general meeting. And this particular manager held that true, thinking the committee has got no responsibility to understand whether they should be managing or whether they shouldn't be managers. Where for me, I'm thinking, well, they're the ones who are dealing and communicating with the manager on a day-to-day basis, so they are most qualified to make that decision. But anyway, this manager, the committee had already tried 3 times over 9 years to terminate this manager. And then they found us, and I was like, okay, I can see all the hurdles that they've put in place. We'll just knock one over at the time. So we actually had to convene an SGM. And I didn't convene an SGM to terminate the manager because they'd already tried that previously. And what happened was that manager would nominate new committee members and overthrow the committee by proxy farming. So therefore a new committee would be elected and their termination wouldn't go through. So what I did was I convened an SGM just to restore the committee's powers, so that the committee had that power. And the manager was like, you can't do that. Yeah, I can, right? Because I knew the legislation and the committee were succumbing to being bullied and stepping back because, the particular woman who was handling the whole process was very fierce, but I was fiercer. So it took probably 3 months for me to do the process, and finally this particular manager was terminated and the committee saved $180,000 a year in fees. And then what happened was, after it all happened, the manager, as they walked out the door, sent a letter to all 400 lot owners that was 13 pages long, just basically bagging the crap out of the OC Guide and how I didn't follow legislation, which was all incorrect. Like, every step that I took absolutely followed legislation, but the way you perceive legislation can be different, and their opinion was very different. But at the end of the day, that manager wasn't acting in the best interest of the owners corporation. They were acting in the best interest of themselves. The committees make decisions. They don't. The manager doesn't have the power to make those decisions, and they were doing that. Yeah.
I guess as in your space, you're going to be drawn into every situation you come across is going to be one of conflict and of challenge.
Not everyone,
with managers.
no.
So I just want to give comfort that there's a lot of good companies.
There are a lot of good companies.
Great services.
But you have to find them. And that's where the OC Guide comes in. Now, I've spent the last 4 years really working out who is ethical and who offers really good service and doesn't play these games. Because, I still see it. I still see. So at the moment, from 2021, you can no longer include in a management contract that a decision for termination has to be made in AGM. So what the naughty managers have done is they put the motion in the AGM. So therefore, even though the committee have been given all the powers and all the delegated authority, at an AGM, people don't really pay attention. So when they come to me and go, I want to do a tender process, the first thing I ask for, I want to see the minutes from the last AGM. And you have no idea how many times I have to say to the committee, you do realise you don't have the power to do that? And they're like, what do you mean? Because they're not paying attention, right? They're kind of just assuming, and they're having trust in their manager that the manager wouldn't do that. But they do it. Because it's a really long motion, or it's on a separate piece of paper, and you get an AGM notice and it's 100 pages long, they don't read every word. And managers know that. So it's just really naughty, is all I can say. So the first thing I have to do is restore the committee's powers before they can even proceed.
So looking ahead, how do you see the role of an OC manager evolving? What's an emerging trend perhaps with owners corporations that they should consider when selecting a management company?
I think what's evolving is the software and the way that people communicate. You have some committees who talk about they're over email. Email was amazing, but now it's becoming problematic because of the way you're copying. It can become long-winded. I think in tech savvy, they need better software. But as I said before, it's a double-edged sword because it depends on the committee. You can have software, and I think it's moving towards that automation's way. But if the committee use an older committee, they're not going to want that software. And also, you're talking about community living. They want that in-person, feel-good customer service experience as well. So I don't know if automation is going to solve all the problems in the OC industry and make things great. I think that if all the millennials come in 10 years' time and they want it all automated, well, then that's the way it will be. But at the moment, I can't see how that is going to work. Because, they come to me because I say to them, what do you want in an OC manager? Oh, we want their mobile number. We want to be able to talk to them. We want to know that they care. Well, you can't get that with automation, can you? Yeah, it's all about relationships. The most successful relationships between OC managers and committees are ones where there is active in-person communication on a regular basis.
All right, thank you for joining us, Melissa Harvey from the OC Guide. There's some great tips and takeaways for all of our audience on the tender process, how to run them, how to choose your manager. So make sure to check out the resource. It will be on our website. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to the next episode of Quantum Conversations.